As you begin the process of planning your outline for your essay, it's important to focus on the body portion first. You can add the introduction and the conclusion later, but you don't know what needs to go into either of those parts until you know what your main argument is. So we will focus today just on the body portion. This is the most important portion of the outline because it's where you lay out your argument to convince your readers. For today's example, I chose something that's a little bit playful. I'm focusing on the hobbits, who are a people who feature quite prominently in the works of J.R. Tolkien. If you've never heard about them, they are small people. They're about half the size of humans, and they have some other characteristics that are a little bit different that we'll get into in a minute. In looking at what Tolkien said about the hobbits, how he described them, I decided that they are in fact diabetic. I also looked up high-level medical resources to prove my case. I will not show the citations here because this is just my outline, but if I were writing the paper, I would in fact cite both the Tolkien texts and the medical resources. So my thesis statement, as you can see here on the screen, is very, very simple. The hobbits are diabetic. It's clear, it's to the point, and it's something that I can indeed prove. I'm going to start my body portion of my paper by focusing first on the diet of the hobbits, which is actually kind of amusing. They eat every few hours. They have breakfast, and then they have second breakfast, and then they have lunch, and so forth throughout the day. This is very consistent with a diabetic diet. Dietitians recommend that diabetics eat 3 meals a day plus 3 snacks. So we see a commonality there. We also see a commonality in what the hobbits eat. They eat mostly whole grains, vegetables, and fruits, and that's exactly what's recommended for diabetics to eat. So now I have a pretty strong piece of evidence that points to the hobbits having a diabetic diet. That, of course, is not a complete proof, but it is one piece of evidence. So now I have to lay out some other evidence to convince my audience. Well, now I'm going to look at them physically, and the first feature that really stands out is that they have very large feet, like strangely, abnormally large feet, and oddly, they have a habit of going barefoot. So I need to look into that. Well, looking at my medical resources, swelling and neuropathy. Neuropathy means having nerve pain and also, oddly at the same time, having a lack of feeling. Both of these are symptoms of advanced diabetes. So the large feet, that makes sense, but I'm a little bit puzzled because these are farmers. They use farm implements, and if you think of something like using a hoe, it's pretty dangerous not to wear shoes doing that. So as I think about that, I think, well, shoes are very constricting and they place pressure on the foot. So this is an indication that the hobbits are in so much pain from their swollen feet and their neuropathy that they're willing to risk hurting themselves with their farm implements because they can't stand the pain of wearing shoes. Also, in looking at them physically, as I mentioned above, they're very small in stature. Well, I know from my medical resources that stunted growth is a sign of advanced diabetes. Now I have to think about what my readers might say or what experts on the hobbits might say arguing against me. And the strongest argument they have is that hobbits love pies. They're famous for eating pies and other sweets as well. Clearly that's not consistent with a diabetic diet. So I can't just leave that out there unsaid. I have to acknowledge that. But I also want to knock down that counter argument, which is pretty easy. It's pretty obvious to me that the hobbits are cheating on their diet by eating these pies, and that their advanced symptoms of diabetes are the result of this cheating on their diet all the time. That's why they have swollen feet and why they are stunted in their growth. Both of those are signs of diabetes that's not under control. Clearly, that's why the pie eating makes sense in the context of these other symptoms. So I think I've done a pretty good job of shooting down that counter argument. But I don't want to end my paper on the counter argument. That's a bad strategy. I don't want people to focus on what other people say against me. So I want to bring the argument around now to my side. I'm going to focus now more broadly. I looked at them individually. Now I'm going to look at them collectively. As I mentioned earlier, the place where they live is isolated. It's a little farming community. They almost never leave the place. So that explains why the whole society is stunted in its growth, why they look the way they do. They intermarry, and they have intermarried for generations, so the whole species is diabetic. I think that's a pretty solid proof. I want to point out that the counterargument doesn't have to go exactly there. I could have put my counterargument up at the top where I'm talking about the diet, but I was afraid that that would distract my audience from my main flow of my arguments, and I didn't want to knock down my own claim about the diet, so I decided to leave that rest until a little bit later. You really could put your counterargument anywhere except as your first paragraph. You don't want to lead with the counterargument against your point, and you don't want to end on it, but anywhere else in between that it makes sense, you can place it. I hope that's helpful to you as you go about the process of planning your own essay.